One pointed finger from a hysterical child, and your life is over. Welcome to the witch trials, where your neighbours become your executioners and your innocence becomes your death sentence. But before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you like these stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this from and what time it is for you. You'd be surprised of how many of us are here at the same time. Picture this. You're minding your own business in 1692 Salem, maybe brewing some questionable ale, or arguing with your neighbour about those damn property lines that keep mysteriously shifting in his favour. The sun's setting, you're thinking about supper, maybe wondering if your wife remembered to feed the chickens. Life is predictable, boring even, exactly the way you like it. Then it happens. A 12-year-old girl starts convulsing in the town square like she's being torn apart by invisible hands. Her body contorts in ways that make grown men step back and cross themselves. And through her screaming, through the foam gathering at the corners of her mouth, she manages to gasp out your name. She claims you sent your spirit, your actual soul, to pinch her in the night, to whisper unholy things in her ear, to drag her toward damnation. Congratulations. Your life just ended. Not literally, yet. But the moment those words leave her mouth, you've crossed into a nightmare where evidence means nothing. Where your protests of innocence are actually proof of your guilt. And where the very people who've known you for decades will line up to watch you burn. The baker who sells you bread every Tuesday morning. He's already calculating how your death might affect his business. The children who play with your kids. They're being coached on what strange things they might have noticed about your family. You think you'd handle it better than those poor souls from centuries past. Think you'd stay calm, present logical arguments, maybe hire a decent lawyer and sort this whole misunderstanding out with some civilized legal proceedings. Well, buckle up, because we're about to walk through exactly why you'd be just as doomed as everyone else who faced the witch trials, twisted machinery of death. So you've been accused, now what? Maybe you're thinking the community will rally around you. After all, these people have known you for years. They've borrowed your tools when theirs broke, shared meals at your table during the harvest celebrations, watched your children grow up alongside theirs. Surely they'll speak up for your character, vouch for your Christian faith, maybe even point out how ridiculous this whole accusation sounds. Wrong, dead wrong. The moment witchcraft gets mentioned, human nature reveals its ugliest face. That same neighbour who owes you 3 bushels of wheat, the one who's been avoiding you for months because he can't pay, suddenly remembers how your cow gave sour milk last month, right after you had words with him. Suspicious timing, isn't it? Your childhood friend, the woman you've known since you were both gap-toothed girls braiding each other's hair, suddenly recalls that time you muttered under your breath after she refused to lend you her spinning wheel. Obviously you were casting a curse. These aren't strangers destroying your life. They're people who've been silently cataloguing every petty slight, every awkward interaction, every moment when you were less than perfectly pleasant. That time you snapped at someone because you were exhausted from nursing a sick child. Demonic anger. The day you correctly guessed it would rain when the sky was clear. Unnatural knowledge. Even your acts of kindness get twisted. Why else would you help that poor widow unless you were trying to recruit her into your coven? The accusation spreads like wildfire because, let's be brutally honest, witch trials were the ultimate community entertainment, and who doesn't love a good scandal when life is otherwise mind-numbingly boring? Your neighbours aren't just abandoning you, they're actively participating in your destruction while convincing themselves they're doing God's work. Think you can prove your innocence through some kind of rational test? How adorably naive. Let me introduce you to the water ordeal, a test so brilliantly rigged that you literally cannot win, no matter what happens. Here's how this masterpiece of twisted logic works. They tie your hands and feet with rope, binding you like a package, then throw you into deep water while the entire town watches from the shore. If you float, and bound people often do, because trapped air keeps them buoyant, congratulations. You're obviously a witch who's been rejected by the baptismal waters because of your evil nature. Time to burn. If you sink like a stone and drown in front of everyone, well, you were innocent all along. Oops. Too bad you're dead and can't enjoy your vindication. But wait, there's more. Maybe they'll search your body for the devil's mark. Any mole, scar, birthmark, or blemish that doesn't feel pain when pricked with a needle. The examiner pokes every inch of your naked body while you're held down by multiple people, searching for that one spot where the devil supposedly touched you. Don't have any marks. That's suspicious. The devil's mark could be invisible to human eyes. Have a mole or scar. There it is. Proof positive of your satanic covenant. Perhaps they'll make you recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly, word for word, without a single stumble. Sounds easy enough, right? Try doing it while your hands are bound. Your life hangs in the balance, and dozens of hostile faces stare at you, waiting for you to fail. Stumble on a single word due to, oh, I don't know. The paralyzing terror of facing execution. Clearly the devil won't let you speak God's words properly. Every single test was designed with one goal, confirming what they had already decided. You weren't on trial, you were starring in an elaborate execution ceremony with legal decorations. So you failed every impossible test. What's next? You get to spend your final night in a cell that makes modern prison look like a luxury resort. We're talking about a stone hole barely wide enough for your body, where the straw hasn't been changed in months, and the smell of previous occupants' terror still lingers in every corner. But here's the real psychological torture. Hope. You spend those endless hours convincing yourself that someone will come forward, that sanity will prevail, that God will intervene with some miraculous proof of your innocence. You replay every conversation, every relationship, desperately trying to figure out who might speak for you. Meanwhile, outside your cell, the townspeople are already building your pyre. The sound of hammers echoes through the night as they construct the platform where you'll die tomorrow. They're not losing sleep over your fate, they're excited. This is the biggest event their boring little town has seen in years. You'll barely sleep, and when morning comes, you'll realise that hope was the cruelest torture of all. Welcome to your trial, and I use that term loosely. You're facing judges who've already decided your guilt, in a system where the rules change based on how the wind blows that particular morning. Your accuser, that 12-year-old girl, starts writhing and screaming the moment you enter the room. She claims your mere presence is causing her physical agony. The judges nod sagely, as if this performance constitutes compelling evidence. You try to speak in your defense, but every word you utter somehow makes things worse. Deny the charges? That's exactly what a witch would say. Admit to being a witch in hopes of mercy? Perfect, case closed. Stay silent. Clearly you're consulting with demons for your next move. The evidence against you includes a neighbour's sick pig, last summer's poor harvest, the fact that you live alone, and oh yes, that one time you correctly predicted it would rain, because apparently weather forecasting equals supernatural powers. Your fate was decided before you walked through those doors, but they'll maintain this elaborate charade of justice to make everyone feel better about what they're about to do to you. Still maintaining your innocence? How inconvenient. Time for the professionals to get involved. Welcome to a world where causing maximum pain without causing death has been perfected into an art form. The torturer knows exactly how much agony the human body can endure before shutting down completely, and he'll keep you right at that threshold until you give them what they want. The thumbscrews slowly crush your fingers while you're asked, again and again, to confess. The strappado dislocates your shoulders as you dangle by your arms, twisted behind your back. Each method has been carefully calibrated through centuries of trial and error on previous victims. Here's the brilliant part. The torture continues until you confess, but confessing doesn't stop the torture, it just changes the questions. Now they want names. Who else is in your coven? Who taught you witchcraft? Who have you corrupted? You'll give them names. Everyone does. You'll accuse innocent people just to make the pain stop for 5 minutes, creating a cascade of new victims. And later, in whatever fragments of sanity you have left, you'll hate yourself for it, almost as much as you hate them. Here's the moment that breaks most people before the execution even happens. Watching your own family turn their backs on you to save themselves. Your husband, who shared your bed for 20 years, suddenly testifies that you have been acting strangely lately. Those herbs you grew for cooking, clearly ingredients for potions. That time you correctly predicted Mrs. Henderson's pregnancy. Unnatural knowledge that could only come from dark sources. Your children, your own flesh and blood, are coached by neighbours and relatives to remember every harsh word you ever spoke to them, every time you disciplined them, every moment when exhaustion made you less than perfectly maternal. Under pressure from adults, they'll recall how you sometimes talk to yourself while working. Obviously, you were conversing with demons, but here's the psychological masterpiece of it all. Your family's abandonment actually becomes evidence against you. If you were truly innocent, the reasoning goes, wouldn't your loved ones defend you? Their silence, their careful distance, their public denouncement. It all confirms what everyone already believes. You realise in those final days that love is conditional when survival is at stake. And honestly, you might even understand their choice, which makes the betrayal hurt worse. So you've survived the torture, the sham trial, and the abandonment. Now comes your grand finale. But even your execution is designed to extract maximum entertainment value from your suffering. Because apparently, even death needs to be profitable in this twisted social economy. You're dragged through the muddy streets to the town square where literally everyone has gathered to watch you die. And I mean everyone, from toddlers barely old enough to walk to elderly folks who've hauled themselves out of sick beds just for this spectacle. Children are hoisted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view over the crowd. Vendors weave through the masses selling meat pies, ale, and roasted nuts like this is some kind of medieval Super Bowl. This is the social event of the decade, and you're the unwilling star of a show nobody wants to miss. The platform they've built for your execution isn't just functional, it's theatrical. Raised high enough so the back rows can see your final moments, decorated with religious symbols to make everyone feel holy about what they're witnessing. The wood is dry, the kindling carefully arranged for maximum flame. They've even tested it beforehand to ensure optimal burning conditions. Your death has been planned with the same attention to detail most people reserve for weddings. They give you one last chance to confess, to name your co-conspirators, to provide the crowd with the satisfying admission of guilt they've been craving for months. The priest leans in close, whispering about salvation and God's mercy, but his eyes are bright with excitement. Refuse to confess, and they'll interpret your silence as demonic defiance. Proof that Satan has such a hold on your soul that you'd rather burn than repent. Confess, and you'll spend your final moments listening to the crowd cheer your honesty, while they still burn you alive anyway. Because confession doesn't earn you a reprieve, just a slightly cleaner conscience for the spectators. If you're lucky, and luck is relative when you're about to be executed, they'll strangle you with a rope before lighting the fire. It's considered merciful, a sign that maybe you showed proper remorse at the end. If you're not lucky, well, burning alive takes a surprisingly long time, and the crowd expects a show. They've paid good money for food and drinks, taken time off from their daily labour, dressed in their finest clothes. The least you can do is provide some memorable screaming. Your agony becomes their entertainment, but more than that, it becomes their spiritual experience. Your screams of pain will be interpreted as demons leaving your body, which somehow makes everyone feel righteous about what they're witnessing. The more you suffer, the more convinced they become that they're watching evil being purged from their community. Even in death, you can't escape the narrative they have constructed around you. Now here's the question that should keep you awake at night. Why did entire communities, not just a few religious fanatics, but whole towns full of otherwise ordinary people, participate in this madness? Because understanding the answer reveals something terrifying about human nature that's still disturbingly relevant today. Witch trials weren't random outbreaks of medieval superstition or temporary mass insanity. They were sophisticated social pressure valves that allowed communities to purge their collective anxieties, settle old scores, and reinforce existing social hierarchies under the convenient guise of religious duty. That weird neighbour who never quite fit in, who kept to herself and made people uncomfortable with her independence. Perfect witch material. That woman who spoke up too often in community meetings, who questioned authority or challenged traditional gender roles. Time to put her in her place permanently. Economic stress creates the perfect breeding ground for this kind of scapegoating. Crop failures, livestock diseases, unexplained deaths. Someone has to be responsible for these misfortunes, and it's much easier to blame the village outcast than to accept that life is random and cruel. Religious upheaval adds another layer of anxiety, while political instability makes everyone paranoid about enemies within their own communities. The accusers weren't motivated purely by malice. They genuinely needed to believe in the guilt of their victims. People need someone to blame for their problems, and witch trials provided a socially acceptable outlet for that blame. Accusers got to feel powerful and righteous while destroying lives, convincing themselves they were protecting their families and serving God's will. The most chilling part isn't the cruelty, it's the sincerity. The accusers genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They slept peacefully after watching you burn because they'd successfully rid their community of evil. Their children grew up thinking this was normal, that this was justice, that this was necessary for a godly society to function. Here's what you really need to understand. What should make your skin crawl when you think about it? The people who participated in witch trials weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were ordinary humans dealing with fear, uncertainty, and social pressure, just like people today, just like you. Strip away our modern legal protections, add some economic stress and social upheaval, throw in an authority figure pointing fingers and demanding loyalty. And how different are we really? Look around at how quickly communities turn on individuals during moral panics. How readily people believe accusations that confirm their existing biases. How effectively fear overrides rational thinking, even in our supposedly enlightened age. You think you'd be the brave soul standing up for the accused, risking your own safety to defend an innocent person. Statistics and psychology suggest otherwise. You'd probably be in that crowd, convincing yourself that where there's smoke there's fire, that you're protecting your family by staying quiet, that surely the authorities know what they're doing. You'd find ways to rationalise your silence, your complicity, your participation. The witch trials ended not because humanity became more enlightened or morally superior, but because the legal system eventually developed better safeguards against mass hysteria and false accusations. But those safeguards aren't permanent or unbreakable. They're only as strong as each generation's commitment to maintaining them, and history shows how quickly they can erode under pressure. So the next time you see a community turning on one of its members, ask yourself, are you watching justice unfold? Or are you watching the same old human drama that once filled town squares with smoke and screaming? The capacity for witch trials lies dormant in all of us, waiting for the right combination of fear, authority, and social pressure to wake it up. The only question is, what would it take to wake it up in you? Picture this. It's 4 a.m. in medieval England, and while everyone else is still dreaming of not dying of plague, you're stumbling through the darkness toward what amounts to a culinary torture chamber. Your first task? Building a fire that could easily burn down the entire castle, and everyone in it. You think cooking is hard now? Try doing it when striking a spark requires genuine skill. when kindling is often damp from the perpetual English drizzle, and when the difference between perfectly roasted and everything's on fire comes down to whether you can judge heat by holding your hand over flames without third-degree burns. No pressure gauges, no thermometers, no safety switches, just you, some flint, and the knowledge that if you screw this up, you might literally kill everyone you work for. And that's before you even start thinking about breakfast. Your day begins in pitch darkness because cooking a proper medieval feast takes 12 to 14 hours of back-breaking labour. While modern chefs complain about dinner rushes, you're looking at feeding anywhere from 50 to 300 people using technology that hasn't improved since the Romans figured out fire. Welcome to the most dangerous job in the castle. So you've got your fire going, congratulations. You've survived the first hour, now comes the fun part. Trying to determine which of your ingredients might actually murder your employers before dinner. That meat hanging in the larder, it's been there for weeks, preserved with salt that might be contaminated. In a room where rats have definitely been partying all night. Your job is to figure out if it's aged or actively decomposing. And medieval people weren't exactly picky about the difference. The spices that cost more than most people's annual salary. They've travelled thousands of miles in conditions that would make a modern health inspector weep. That expensive saffron could be mixed with lead paint for colour. The pepper might be bulked out with mouse droppings. And don't even get me started on the fresh herbs that have been sitting in damp storage for months. Medieval preservation methods basically amounted to salt it, smoke it, pray it doesn't kill anyone. You're working with vegetables that look nothing like their modern counterparts. Remember, selective breeding hadn't created the perfect produce we know today. Your onions are tiny, bitter and half rotten. Your grains might be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations and death. Every single ingredient is a gamble with your employer's life. And if they die, guess who's getting blamed? Think you're good at eyeballing doneness. Medieval cooks had to master cooking over open flames with zero temperature control, using techniques that would send modern safety inspectors into cardiac arrest. Your oven, it's basically a stone cave heated by shoving burning wood inside, then scraping out the coals and hoping you've judged the residual heat correctly. Temperature testing involves sticking your hand inside and reciting prayers. If you could get through the Lord's Prayer without yanking your hand back in agony, it was ready. No timers, no temperature probes, no consistent heat. You're roasting a boar over flames that fluctuate wildly depending on wind direction, wood quality, and whether you remembered to tend the fire while prepping 50 other dishes simultaneously. The cauldrons you're using weigh more than you do when full, hanging over fires that could easily tip and splash boiling liquid everywhere. You're stirring massive pots with wooden spoons while wearing wool clothing near open flames. It's like playing Russian roulette, but with medieval technology and much higher stakes. And here's the kicker. You're expected to produce consistent results every single time, despite working with equipment that changes its behaviour based on humidity, air pressure, and the phases of the moon. Welcome to your workspace. A stone room filled with smoke, scalding metal, and enough fire hazards to make OSHA agents retire early. Medieval kitchens were designed by people who apparently thought safety was a type of expensive spice. The floors are stone, which means every drop pot becomes a potential ankle breaker, and every spill of boiling liquid creates a slip hazard that could send you tumbling into the central hearth. The walls are thick stone too, which means sound echoes hideously, and heat builds up like an oven. An oven you're trapped inside for 14 hours a day. Ventilation consists of holes in the walls that let in rain, snow, and armies of insects that consider your food preparation their personal buffet. The massive fireplaces that dominate the room produce enough smoke to choke a dragon, and since chimneys were still figuring themselves out, you're basically working in a controlled forest fire. Your tools are heavy iron implements that get scorching hot and stay that way for hours. No pot holders, no heat-resistant gloves, just your medieval pain tolerance and whatever rags you can wrap around the handles. Kitchen accidents weren't just common, they were inevitable. Burns, cuts, smoke inhalation, and heat exhaustion were just part of the job description. And you're sharing this nightmare space with anywhere from 5 to 50 other stressed, overworked people wielding sharp knives and boiling liquids. So you've managed to cook something without burning down the castle. Now comes the real nightmare, making sure it doesn't kill everyone who eats it. Because medieval food preservation was basically a continuous game of will this give everyone dysentery? Your meat storage consists of hanging carcasses in a cold stone room where the temperature fluctuates wildly depending on the season, and cold is relative when you're dealing with English weather that can't decide if it wants to be winter or slightly less miserable winter. That venison needs to last 3 weeks. Better pack it in salt that costs more than a peasant's house, and pray the rats don't get to it first. Dairy products turn into biological weapons within hours. Your milk sours faster than political alliances, and your cheese develops more cultures than the Renaissance. You're constantly playing food roulette. Is that white stuff on the bread flour, or is it the kind of mould that makes people see God before they die horribly? Fish preservation involves techniques that would make modern food scientists weep. You're salting, smoking, and pickling everything in sight, using methods passed down through generations of people who had no idea why they worked. If they worked. That barrel of pickled herring might feed the castle for a month, or it might become a medieval bioweapon that takes out half the nobility. And here's the beautiful irony. If people get sick, it's your fault. Not the lack of refrigeration, not the contaminated water, not the complete absence of any understanding about bacteria. You, the cook, become the scapegoat for every stomach ailment, every bout of food poisoning, every mysterious fever that follows dinner. Think following recipes is challenging now. Try cooking when your cookbook consists of vague instructions like cook until it pleases the Lord and add spices to taste, when those spices cost more than your annual salary and getting the proportions wrong could literally bankrupt your employer. Medieval recipes weren't written for cooks, they were written by and for the wealthy people who ate the food, assuming you already knew the 50 steps they didn't bother writing down. Take a goose and prepare it well, leaves out minor details like how to properly dress the bird, what temperature to cook it at, and how long it should take. You're expected to figure out the mysteries of medieval gastronomy through trial and error, except errors mean you've just wasted a week's worth of wages on ruined ingredients. The measurements are poetry, not precision. A handful of what? Your hands or the Lord's delicate aristocratic fingers. Season well, with which spices, in what proportions, and for whose palate. Iwahol. Every recipe assumes you can read the mind of whoever wrote it, usually some noble who watched you cook once and decided they understood the process. You're also expected to scale recipes up and down constantly. That delicate sauce recipe designed for 6 people. Better figure out how to make it work for 60 using equipment that measures ingredients in some, more, and probably enough. Mathematics wasn't exactly a strong point for most medieval cooks, and calculators wouldn't be invented for another few centuries. Here's where medieval cooking gets really fun. You're not just responsible for making food, you're personally responsible for the health, happiness, and political success of people who consider you somewhere between a useful tool and a slightly intelligent farm animal. Your lord doesn't just employ you, he owns you. Your life, your time, your energy, even your family's welfare depends entirely on keeping him fed and happy. Have a bad day and oversalt the soup. That's not just a cooking mistake. It's a personal insult that could get you beaten, fired, or worse. Medieval nobles weren't known for their patience or understanding when it came to servant failures. The political implications of every meal are staggering. You're not just cooking dinner, you're managing diplomatic relations through food. Serve an important guest something subpar, and you might have just created an international incident. Forget to accommodate someone's dietary restrictions. Yes, medieval people had those too. And you could spark a family feud that lasts generations. And the hours. Try working 18-hour days during feast periods, which happen whenever your lord decides to show off. No overtime pay, no breaks, no weekends off. You work when they want to eat, which is all the time, and you rest when they don't need you, which is never. Your social position means you get blamed for everything food-related, but credited for nothing. Amazing feast that impresses foreign dignitaries, the Lord's excellent taste and generous hospitality, food poisoning that kills half the dinner party. Obviously you were negligent, possibly treasonous, but here's your worst nightmare scenario. The day when everything you've been carefully managing finally goes catastrophically wrong, all at once. And in medieval times, when disaster strikes, it doesn't just ruin your day, it ruins your entire existence. Picture this. You're preparing for the biggest feast of the year, maybe a royal visit or a wedding celebration that your lord has been planning for months. The kitchen is operating at maximum capacity. Fires are burning in every hearth. Dozens of dishes are in various stages of preparation, and the pressure is absolutely crushing. Then something goes wrong. Maybe the wind shifts and fills the kitchen with smoke, making it impossible to see what you're doing. Maybe one of the kitchen boys knocks over a pot of boiling oil, starting a grease fire that spreads faster than gossip. Maybe the main roasting spit breaks under the weight of that massive ox you've been cooking for 8 hours, sending burning meat and fat everywhere. In minutes, everything you've worked for goes up in flames, literally. The bread burns, the wine gets contaminated with ash, the meat becomes charcoal, and the vegetables turn into expensive compost. Months of planning, days of preparation, and your employer's reputation all disappear in a cloud of smoke and chaos. But here's the truly terrifying part. This isn't just a professional setback. In medieval times, this kind of failure could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. You've just cost your lord enormous amounts of money, embarrassed him in front of his peers, and possibly damaged his political relationships. And someone needs to pay for that disaster. Think the physical demands of modern restaurant work are brutal. Try doing it in medieval times when workplace safety meant not accidentally stabbing yourself with your own knife more than once per day. Your body becomes a collection of occupational hazards masquerading as a human being. Those massive iron pots you're lifting, they weigh 40 to 60 pounds when empty, and up to 200 pounds when full of stew. You're hauling these monsters around a kitchen with uneven stone floors, no proper lifting equipment, and zero understanding of ergonomics. Your back doesn't just ache, it screams in protest every morning when you try to stand upright. The constant heat exposure turns your skin into leather. You're working inches from open flames for 14 hours a day, in rooms that reach temperatures that would violate modern workplace regulations. Heat exhaustion isn't just common, it's a daily occurrence. Dehydration becomes your constant companion, because stopping to drink water means falling behind on the impossible schedule everyone expects you to maintain. Your hands become a roadmap of kitchen disasters. Burns from hot metal, cuts from dull knives that require more pressure to work, blisters from stirring enormous pots for hours at a time. Medieval medicine's solution for kitchen injuries amounts to wrap it in dirty cloth and keep working, which means every minor cut risks becoming a life-threatening infection. The smoke inhalation slowly destroys your lungs. Medieval kitchens produce more smoke than a forest fire, and you're breathing it all day, every day, for years. That persistent cough all cooks develop. It's not just clearing your throat, it's your respiratory system slowly giving up the fight against constant chemical assault. And here's the kicker. You're expected to maintain this punishing pace well into your 40s or 50s, which in medieval terms means you're practically ancient. Most kitchen workers don't retire. They collapse, develop chronic illnesses, or die from accumulated workplace injuries. Your career path doesn't lead to advancement, it leads to physical breakdown. Now here's the final crushing reality that should keep you awake at night. Everything we've just described was considered normal, even prestigious work in medieval society. Being a castle cook wasn't just a job, it was supposed to be an honour. Medieval hospitality culture meant that a lord's reputation depended entirely on his ability to feed guests extravagantly and consistently. Your failures didn't just reflect poorly on your skills, they damaged your employer's social standing, political relationships, and economic prospects. Every meal was a performance where anything less than perfection could trigger consequences that rippled through the entire social hierarchy. The pressure was psychological warfare. You weren't just cooking food, you were maintaining your lord's honour, protecting his alliances, demonstrating his wealth, and proving his worthiness to rule. Mess up a feast for important guests, and you might have just weakened his political position, damaged trade relationships, or even contributed to military conflicts. Medieval politics operated through displays of wealth and power, and food was one of the primary ways to demonstrate both. But here's what makes it truly insidious. This system convinced everyone, including you, that this was how things should be. The suffering, the impossible standards, the physical breakdown, the constant terror of failure, it was all framed as noble service, as fulfilling your proper role in God's grand design. You were supposed to feel grateful for the opportunity to sacrifice your health, your sanity, and your life for the privilege of keeping aristocrats well fed. The most successful medieval cooks weren't the ones who found easier ways to work, or who advocated for better conditions. They were the ones who completely surrendered their individual needs to the demands of the kitchen, who internalized the system so completely that they became willing participants in their own destruction. So the next time you complain about modern work conditions, remember that our ancestors thought this medieval nightmare was not just acceptable, but admirable. The capacity for normalizing exploitation lives in every society. We've just gotten better at hiding it behind prettier words and slightly less obvious forms of control. The question isn't whether you could survive as a medieval cook. The question is, what modern equivalent of this system are you already participating in without even realizing it? Picture this. It's 5 a.m. in January 1347, and you're lying in what passes for a bedroom in a medieval castle. But instead of waking up refreshed, you're waking up to discover that your water basin has frozen solid overnight. And that was indoors, next to what was supposed to be a heated room. Congratulations! You're about to experience firsthand why medieval castles were basically elaborate stone death traps designed to slowly freeze their inhabitants to death. Those impressive stone walls you admired from the outside, they're working against you now. Stone absorbs cold like a medieval sponge and holds onto it with the determination of a tax collector. We're talking about walls that are 3 to 10 feet thick, creating a thermal mass so enormous that once they get cold, they stay cold for days, even weeks at a time. Your castle isn't just cold, it's actively radiating coldness into every room like some kind of medieval air conditioning system that nobody asked for and can't turn off. The thick stone walls that make the castle defensible also make it uninhabitable, turning your living space into what one medieval writer described as a place where a man's face might burn while his back freezes. You think modern buildings get chilly? Try spending a winter in a structure designed by people who prioritize keeping arrows out over keeping warmth in. Every surface you touch will be cold enough to make you gasp. Every breath you take will be visible in the frigid air, and every step on those stone floors will remind you that comfort is a modern luxury your ancestors never experienced. So you have survived the night in your frozen stone box. Now comes the fun part of discovering that medieval castle architecture was basically designed to create the perfect wind tunnel system throughout the entire structure. Those narrow window slits that look so romantic in movies. They're actually gaps that let cold air pour into your room constantly. Medieval glass was expensive and largely ineffective, So most windows were just openings covered with wooden shutters, oilcloth, or thin sheets of animal horn. Even in royal chambers, windows leaked cold air continuously, creating drafts that would make modern building inspectors weep with horror. The castle's layout works against you at every turn. Great halls with ceilings reaching 40 feet high mean all the warm air simply rises up and disappears into the vast emptiness above, leaving you shivering in the cold zone below, where humans actually try to live. Spiral staircases act like massive wind tunnels, channeling frigid air throughout the castle with ruthless efficiency. Your bedroom isn't a private sanctuary, it's part of a network of chambers and hallways that allows drafts to sneak in from every conceivable direction. The stone floors act like thermal vampires, sucking heat from your body the moment your bare feet touch them. Medieval nobles quickly learnt that walking barefoot on castle floors had nothing to do with religious humility and everything to do with risking genuine frostbite. Even the supposedly smart architectural features work against you. Those thick walls that should theoretically provide insulation instead create thermal bridges that conduct cold directly into your living space. The masonry joints become perfect pathways for frigid air to seep through, turning every wall into a network of tiny ice highways leading straight to your shivering body. Think a nice roaring fire will solve your heating problems? How adorably naive. Let me introduce you to medieval fireplace technology, a heating system so spectacularly inefficient, it makes you question whether medieval engineers understood how heat actually works. Early medieval castles often had central open hearths in the Great Hall, basically glorified fire pits in the middle of enormous rooms with no chimneys whatsoever. The smoke just drifted upward, hoping to escape through holes in the wall or ceiling. Most of it didn't, so you got to choose between slowly freezing to death or slowly suffocating from smoke inhalation. Medieval life was all about picking your preferred method of dying. Later castles upgraded to actual fireplaces with chimneys, but these were still masterpieces of thermal inefficiency that would make modern heating engineers quit their jobs in despair. They filled rooms with smoke, struggled to warm even the immediate area directly around them, and were completely useless for heating rooms with 20-foot ceilings where all the heat disappeared into unreachable heights. Your medieval fireplace consumes enormous amounts of fuel while producing pathetically little usable heat. Historical records show that one French king's castle used over 6,000 logs in a single winter month, and people were still complaining about bone-chilling cold. The royal woodcutters had permanent job security, because they were literally the only people in the entire castle who worked up a sweat during January. But here's the real kicker. Even massive fires burning continuously throughout the castle barely made a dent in the overwhelming coldness. Windsor Castle records show that even after fires had been burning for 2 full days straight, visitors still complained about bone-chilling cold inside the supposedly heated chambers. The fireplace becomes a cruel joke. It promises warmth while delivering mostly smoke, and the occasional spark that might burn down the tapestries you desperately need for insulation. You'll spend more time feeding it fuel than actually feeling warm, and the moment you step away from the immediate fire zone, you're back to shivering like a peasant in a snowstorm. Now comes the brutal mathematics of trying to stay warm in a structure specifically designed to defeat every single calorie your body produces. Medieval castles weren't just cold, they were thermal black holes that absorbed your body heat and gave absolutely nothing back in return. Your body produces roughly 100 watts of heat continuously, about the same as a bright light bulb. That sounds like a lot until you realize you're trying to heat a stone chamber that might contain 10,000 cubic feet of air, surrounded by walls that weigh thousands of tons and maintain the temperature of a medieval refrigerator year-round. The stone floors are particularly brutal in their efficiency at making you miserable. They conduct heat away from your feet faster than your body can possibly produce it, creating a continuous thermal drain that leaves you perpetually cold from the ground up. Medieval people quickly learnt that bare skin against castle floors was a guaranteed fast track to hypothermia and potential death. Even your breath works against you in this frozen hellscape. In properly cold castles, your exhalations create visible vapour clouds that immediately disappear into the vast, cold space around you. Every breath you take forces your lungs to warm, cold air from near freezing to body temperature, creating a continuous energy drain that exhausts your body's heating capacity. Your clothing becomes a critical survival tool rather than a fashion choice. Medieval nobles wore multiple layers not because it looked majestic or impressive, but because hypothermia isn't a good look when you're trying to maintain political authority. But even multiple layers of the finest wool and expensive fur struggle helplessly against the thermal mass of a castle actively working to freeze you solid. The mathematics are unforgiving. Your 100-watt biological furnace versus thousands of tons of stone that want to be the same temperature as the frozen ground outside. It's not a fair fight, and you're going to lose slowly, miserably, and inevitably. Here's where it gets really depressing. Even the wealthiest, most powerful people in medieval society, the ones with unlimited resources and armies of servants at their disposal, still froze their aristocratic asses off in their own supposedly luxurious homes. Castle inventories from the Middle Ages show that royal residences had hundreds upon hundreds of tapestries, not for decoration or showing off their wealth, but as desperate attempts at insulation against the cold that was literally killing them. The royal castle at Westminster had more than 300 tapestries in the 14th century, with over 50 tapestries in private chambers alone. They weren't displaying their artistic taste. They were trying not to die of cold exposure in their own bedrooms. These tapestries were hung strategically to trap air between the cold stone walls and the living space, creating primitive insulation systems that barely functioned. The most effective ones were thick, heavy wool that hung slightly away from walls, creating small air pockets that functioned as additional insulation layers. Medieval tapestry hangers understood thermal engineering principles better than you might expect, born from pure survival necessity. But even with hundreds of expensive tapestries, unlimited access to firewood, dedicated staff to maintain fires 24 hours a day, and the absolute best heating technology available at the time, medieval royalty still suffered miserably from the cold. They moved their most valuable tapestries between castles when they travelled because staying warm required serious logistical planning and resource management. The truly wealthy invested in hypercore systems, primitive central heating technology borrowed from the Romans. These systems raised floors on brick pillars, creating hollow spaces underneath where heated air could circulate. But hypocausts were incredibly expensive to build, complex to maintain, required dedicated teams of workers to operate properly, and were still prone to deadly malfunctions that could fill rooms with carbon monoxide. Think your modern bedroom gets chilly during winter. Try sleeping in a medieval castle where going to bed literally becomes a survival challenge that could kill you if you make the wrong decisions. Medieval beds weren't just furniture pieces. They were elaborate survival systems designed to trap every precious calorie of body heat you could produce. Castle beds were surrounded by heavy curtains that created a microclimate within the larger frozen wasteland of your bedroom. These curtains weren't decorative elements. They were life-saving insulation that turned your bed into a fabric cave where you might actually survive until morning without dying of exposure. Some castles had sleeping alcoves carved directly into thick stone walls, literally sleeping in holes carved into the wall like medieval cave dwellers. These niches were designed to trap body heat in the smallest possible space, creating what was essentially a private tomb of warmth, where you could hide from the winter cold trying to kill you. Medieval people heated stones by the fire and placed them at the foot of their beds as primitive hot water bottles. But this desperate survival strategy came with its own deadly risks. Stones that were too hot could cause severe burns that might become infected and kill you, while stones that weren't hot enough would cool down within hours, leaving you to freeze for the remaining 8 hours of winter darkness. The truly desperate shared beds, not for intimacy or companionship, but for pure survival. Body heat from multiple people could raise the temperature in a small enclosed space by 10 to 15 degrees. The difference between surviving the night and dying of hypothermia. Medieval crowdfunding took on a literal meaning when it came to not freezing to death in your own bedroom. Some castle inhabitants slept with their animals during the worst winter months. Dogs, cats, even small livestock became living heating systems that could mean the difference between life and death. Your dignity meant nothing when your survival depended on sharing body heat with whatever warm-blooded creatures you could find. Here's a fun fact that should terrify you about medieval castle life. It was perfectly normal for your breath to be visible indoors all winter long. We're talking about buildings where the interior temperature regularly dropped low enough for basic biological functions to become visible in the air you're trying to breathe. Medieval castles during winter frequently had interior temperatures that hovered around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in supposedly heated rooms where fires burned continuously. In unheated chambers, which was most of the castle, temperatures could drop close to freezing. Water left in basins would freeze solid overnight, even in rooms where fires had burned the previous day. The humidity makes everything exponentially worse. Stone walls create constant condensation as warm, moist air meets cold surfaces, leading to perpetual dampness that makes the cold feel even more penetrating and deadly. Medieval castles were notorious for being cold and damp simultaneously, creating perfect conditions for hypothermia, respiratory illness, and slow death from exposure. Your body starts shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core heat for vital organs. Medieval people developed a kind of winter lethargy, moving slowly, thinking sluggishly, and experiencing the constant fatigue that comes from your metabolism working overtime just to keep you alive. Guards stationed in cold corridors had to rotate duties every hour because staying longer risks serious frostbite and loss of fingers or toes. The smart castle inhabitants quickly figured out that kitchen duty was mysteriously popular during winter months because the kitchen was literally the only consistently warm place in the entire structure. Cooks worked in hellish conditions with scalding heat, smoke inhalation, and constant fire hazards. But at least they worked in warm, hellish conditions where hypothermia wasn't an immediate threat. Even bodily functions became more difficult in extreme cold. Getting dressed required multiple people to help with layers. Using chamber pots became a race against frostbite. Simply walking across stone floors without shoes could cause injury from cold exposure. You'd think those massive, impressive stone walls would provide some insulation against winter cold, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Those imposing fortifications that make castles look so impenetrable are actually working against you in the most brutal way possible. Stone is an excellent conductor of cold temperatures. Those 3 to 10 foot thick walls don't keep cold out. They absorb it greedily from the outside environment and radiate it continuously into your living space like massive cold batteries. The thermal mass is so enormous that once winter weather sets in, the walls become giant storage systems for coldness, releasing it steadily for months. Modern scientific experiments with reconstructed medieval heating systems show that even sophisticated hypercore systems could only maintain room temperatures around 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Considered tropical luxury by medieval standards when most castle rooms stayed around 45 to 50 degrees all winter long. And that was with perfectly functioning, well-maintained systems that most people couldn't afford to build or operate. The castle's architectural design amplifies the cold problem exponentially. High ceilings mean heated air rises immediately away from where people actually live and work. Multiple levels create thermal stratification, where the cold air sinks to exactly where you're trying to exist as a human being. Open floor plans that look impressive and majestic in daylight become wind tunnels that channel frigid air throughout the structure with ruthless efficiency. Even the defensive features that make castles militarily effective work against basic human comfort. Arrow slits and other openings designed for warfare become perfect conduits for cold air infiltration. Murder holes designed to pour boiling oil on attackers also let frigid air pour down onto defenders. The very architectural elements that make castles impregnable fortresses make them thermally disastrous for human habitation. The irony is perfect. The stronger your defenses against human enemies, the weaker your defenses against the cold that's trying to kill you slowly from the inside. Medieval military architecture prioritized keeping people out, not keeping warmth in, creating structures that were simultaneously impregnable and uninhabitable. Here's where medieval castle life gets really desperate. When all the expensive heating methods, elaborate fireplaces, and countless tapestries still leave you slowly freezing to death, your last resort becomes other human beings and their biological furnaces. The Great Hall becomes significantly warmer by design when filled with people during feasts and gatherings. The temperature in these enormous spaces could rise by 10 to 15 degrees from body heat alone when packed with humans. Medieval crowdfunding literally meant cramming as many warm bodies as possible into enclosed spaces to achieve barely survivable temperatures. Historical records from winter feasts note how guests would arrive shivering violently but soon remove outer layers as the combined warmth of hundreds of bodies transformed frigid halls into something almost resembling comfort. A busy feast could pack 400 to 500 people into a great hall, each person radiating roughly 100 watts of heat. Suddenly, you're looking at 40,000 to 50,000 watts of biological central heating that actually worked. But this survival strategy came with its own deadly problems. That many people crammed into an enclosed space creates humidity, overwhelming body odor, and disease transmission risk that made medieval gatherings as dangerous as they were warm. You might survive the cold, but you could easily die from whatever plague, flu, or mysterious fever the person breathing next to you was carrying. Servants and lower-ranking household members often slept in groups not by choice but by absolute necessity. Individual survival meant collective survival, creating social dynamics where personal space became a luxury that could literally kill you if you insisted on it. Now here's the final crushing reality that should keep you awake at night. Medieval people didn't just endure these horrific conditions, they considered them normal, even luxurious compared to the alternatives available to most of humanity. Living in a freezing stone castle wasn't seen as hardship. It was a sign of incredible wealth and elevated status. Peasants lived in wooden huts with thatched roofs that barely retained any heat at all, making stone castles seem relatively tropical by comparison. The fact that you had thick walls, multiple rooms, occasional fires, and actual beds made you incredibly privileged, even if you were still slowly dying of cold exposure in your own supposedly luxurious home. Medieval people developed a completely different relationship with cold and physical discomfort than modern humans can even comprehend. They didn't expect to be warm, they expected to survive. The goal wasn't comfort or pleasant living conditions. It was avoiding immediate death from exposure while maintaining enough physical and mental functionality to manage military, political, and economic responsibilities. The most successful castle inhabitants weren't those who somehow found ways to stay warm, but those who completely adapted their entire lifestyle around being perpetually, miserably cold. They wore multiple layers of clothing constantly, even indoors during summer. They planned all activities around available heat sources. They accepted that winter meant months of genuine physical misery that you simply endured through willpower and social obligation. This brutal system convinced everyone, including the people actively suffering through it, that this was how life should naturally be. The freezing conditions, the constant discomfort, the genuine health risks from prolonged cold exposure. It was all framed as natural, proper, even character building. Medieval people were genuinely proud of their ability to survive conditions that would hospitalize or kill modern humans within days. The psychological adaptation was as complete as the physical adaptation. Castle inhabitants developed what we'd now recognise as symptoms of chronic hypothermia, sluggish thinking, reduced coordination, constant fatigue, but they interpreted these as normal human conditions rather than signs of environmental distress. Even the wealthy invested enormous resources not in achieving actual warmth, but in achieving slightly less deadly cold. The difference between peasant misery and noble luxury was often just a few degrees of temperature and slightly better survival equipment. So the next time you complain about your heating bill or a drafty window, remember that your ancestors considered slow-motion hypothermia a sign of successful, privileged living. They built entire social systems around normalizing extreme physical discomfort and convinced themselves it was not just acceptable, but admirable. The capacity for normalizing extreme discomfort lives in every human society. We've just gotten better at convincing ourselves that our modern suffering is different, more necessary, more justified than what previous generations endured. We tell ourselves we're more enlightened, but we still accept working conditions, living situations, and social expectations that slowly damage our health and well-being. Medieval people worked themselves to death in freezing castles while telling themselves they were living in luxury. What modern equivalent of this frozen hell are you already living in without even realizing it? What current discomfort have you normalized because everyone around you has convinced you it's just how life works? The question isn't whether you could survive a medieval winter in a castle. The question is, what aspects of your current life would medieval people recognize as the same kind of systematic suffering they accepted as normal? What are you enduring right now that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel imagining life in a freezing stone fortress? The castle walls that protected medieval nobles from external enemies also trapped them in a system of internal suffering they couldn't escape. What walls are you living within right now? Human nature hasn't changed. Only the temperature of our prisons has improved. Picture this. You're 7 years old, barely old enough to tie your own shoes, and your parents have just sold you into what amounts to medieval military slavery. But hey, they're better calling it becoming a page. So that makes it sound prestigious, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. At age 7, you're ripped away from everything familiar and dumped into a lord's castle where your childhood officially ends. You become a glorified servant whose entire existence revolves around learning to kill people more efficiently. While other 7-year-olds might be playing with toys, you're learning to polish swords, care for war horses, and memorize the complex social hierarchy that will determine whether you live or die for the next 14 years. Well, history, your day starts before dawn, attending to a knight who sees you as slightly more valuable than his favourite hunting dog. You dress him, serve his meals, clean his weapons, and listen to stories about glorious battles where men die screaming in mud. This isn't character building. It's systematic indoctrination, designed to convince a child that dying violently for someone else's ambitions is the highest possible honour. The page system was brilliantly designed, psychological manipulation. Take children young enough to be moulded, isolate them from family support, and surround them with adult authority figures who constantly reinforce that your only value comes from your willingness to risk death for your social superiors. By the time you're old enough to question this arrangement, you have been so thoroughly brainwashed that questioning it feels like betraying your entire identity. You're not learning a trade or developing skills for civilian life. You're being groomed to become a professional killer whose success is measured by how many people you can slaughter and how willing you are to die doing it. Medieval knight training wasn't education, it was weaponized child development that turned 7-year-olds into adult psychopaths who thought honour meant bleeding to death in foreign fields. So you've survived 7 years of page training and graduated to squire status at 14. Congratulations, now your mistakes can literally trigger international incidents. Because every single thing you do reflects not just on you, but on your knight's honour, your lord's reputation, and sometimes the political stability of entire kingdoms. Medieval knights existed in a social system so fragile that a perceived slight could escalate into decades of warfare. That time you forgot to properly clean your knight's armour before a tournament. You didn't just make him look bad, you potentially insulted every other knight present, questioned his ability to maintain proper standards, and suggested that his household was poorly managed. In medieval politics, that kind of public embarrassment could justify anything from duels to military campaigns. Wikipedia. Your social interactions become minefields where every word, gesture, and even facial expression carries massive political weight. Address someone with the wrong title, insult that could lead to bloodshed. Fail to show proper deference to a higher ranking noble. Disrespect that might require your knight to fight to restore his honour. Accidentally bump into someone at a feast. Potential cause for war if that someone decides to interpret it as intentional disrespect. The pressure is absolutely crushing, because you're not just responsible for your own actions. You're representing an entire chain of feudal obligations that stretch from your immediate lord all the way up to the king. Every mistake you make reflects poorly on everyone above you in the hierarchy, creating a system where paranoia becomes a survival skill and social anxiety is literally life-threatening. You're living in a world where political relationships are maintained through displays of respect, honour, and military capability. Your ability to navigate these relationships successfully determines not just your career prospects, but whether wars start, whether trade agreements hold, and whether entire regions remain peaceful or descend into violence. Here's where medieval knighthood gets really fun. You're expected to bankrupt yourself for the privilege of potentially dying to make your lord richer. The economics of knighthood were specifically designed to ensure that you remained financially dependent on the very system that was slowly killing you. A knight's equipment cost roughly equivalent to a modern luxury car. Every single piece. Your destrier warhorse alone cost more than most peasants earned in their entire lives. Your armour, weapons, and equipment represented an investment that would cripple most modern families financially. And here's the beautiful part. You had to pay for all of it yourself while receiving compensation that barely covered maintenance costs. YouTube. You're essentially running a small military business where your overhead costs also are astronomical and your profit margins are non-existent. The fief you receive in payment for your service generates just enough income to maintain your equipment, support your household, and prepare for the next campaign where you might lose everything you've invested in staying alive. But wait, it gets worse. You're also responsible for equipping and maintaining your own small army of squires, servants, and men-at-arms, Each campaign requires you to bring multiple horses, because they die frequently, backup armor, because it breaks, and enough supplies to sustain your entire entourage for months. You're not just a warrior, you're a military contractor whose business model depends on successfully avoiding death, while participating in activities specifically designed to kill you. The system creates a vicious cycle where you need to participate in more conflicts to generate the resources necessary to participate in conflicts. Success in battle might bring plunder and ransom money, but it also means more expensive equipment, larger households to maintain, and greater expectations for future military contributions. You're trapped in an economic model where the only way to afford being a knight is to risk dying as a knight. Think that shiny armor makes you invincible. Think again. Medieval armor was essentially a wearable oven designed to slow cook you alive while providing the illusion of protection against weapons specifically designed to penetrate it. A full suit of plate armor weighed 60 to 100 pounds and turned every summer campaign into a marathon against heat exhaustion. You're wearing multiple layers of padding, chainmail and steel plates in climates where temperatures regularly exceeded 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat stroke wasn't just common among armoured knights, it was inevitable. Many knights died from overheating before they ever saw combat. Britannica. But the weight is just the beginning of your problems. That armour severely restricts your mobility, meaning once you're knocked down, getting back up becomes a life-threatening challenge. Knights who fell during the battle often died not from weapon wounds, but from being unable to rise quickly enough to defend themselves. Your protection becomes your prison, trapping you in a metal shell that makes you an easy target for enemies with daggers designed specifically for finishing off immobilized armored opponents. The armor also creates massive blind spots and reduces your peripheral vision to almost nothing. You're fighting battles while looking through narrow eye slits, unable to see threats approaching from the sides or behind. Medieval combat became a game of who could maintain situational awareness while wearing equipment designed to eliminate situational awareness. And here's the real kicker. Most medieval weapons were developed specifically to defeat armor. Warhammers crushed armor inward, creating deadly pressure points that could kill without penetrating the metal. Crossbow bolts punched through plate armor like paper. Longbow arrows found gaps in armor with devastating accuracy. You're wearing expensive, heavy, mobility-restricting equipment that doesn't actually protect you from the weapons you're most likely to encounter in battle. Welcome to the medieval world's most elaborate psychological torture system, the Code of Chivalry. This wasn't just a set of guidelines for honourable behaviour. It was a carefully constructed prison of impossible standards, designed to ensure that you never felt worthy of the life you were sacrificing everything to maintain. The chivalric code demanded that you be simultaneously humble and proud, merciful and ruthlessly effective, devoutly religious and professionally violent. You're expected to show mercy to defeated enemies while completely destroying them militarily. You must protect the innocent while participating in campaigns that routinely devastate civilian populations. You should be modest about your achievements while constantly proving your superiority through combat. YouTube. These contradictions weren't accidental. They were designed to create a constant state of moral anxiety that kept knights psychologically dependent on external validation. You could never be sure you were living up to chivalric ideals because those ideals were mutually exclusive. This meant you always needed authorities, lords, church officials, other knights, to confirm that your actions were honourable, creating a system of psychological control that was virtually impossible to escape. The code also required you to seek out dangerous situations to prove your worthiness. A truly chivalrous knight couldn't avoid conflicts or refuse challenges, even when those challenges were obviously suicidal. You were expected to accept any combat invitation from social equals, defend any perceived insult to your honour, and volunteer for the most dangerous military assignments. Chivalry basically mandated that you actively seek opportunities to die. But here's the most insidious part. The chivalric code convinced you that dying while following these impossible standards was not just acceptable, but glorious. Your death in pursuit of contradictory ideals became proof of your moral superiority, creating a belief system where martyrdom was the ultimate success and survival suggested moral failure. Think medieval tournaments were friendly competitions. You're adorably naive. These events were basically legalized murder disguised as entertainment, where knights could die horribly while crowds cheered and nobles placed bets on which participants would survive the day. Early tournaments were essentially practice wars, where teams of knights fought with real weapons until one side was completely defeated. Defeated often meant dead, since medieval combat was designed to kill people as efficiently as possible. Knights regularly died from tournament injuries that would be considered negligent homicide in modern sports, but medieval society treated these deaths as acceptable entertainment. Medieval chronicles. Even later, more civilized tournaments remained deadly. Jousting with blunted lances still generated enough force to crush ribs, break necks, and drive helmet fragments into knights' brains. The famous King Henry II of France died from a tournament injury when his opponent's broken lance penetrated his helmet's visor and drove wooden splinters into his brain. If tournaments could kill kings despite the best available medical care and all and safety precautions, imagine what they did to lesser knights. But tournaments weren't just physically dangerous, they were economic and social catastrophes waiting to happen. Poor performance could destroy your reputation, cost you future employment opportunities, and mark you as unworthy of the investment others had made in your training. Excellent performance created jealousy and challenges from other knights who needed to prove they were superior to the new rising star. You're participating in events where success and failure are both dangerous, where avoiding participation marks you as cowardly, and where participating marks you as a target for everyone trying to advance their own careers by destroying yours. The tournament system created a perfect storm of physical danger, economic pressure, and social manipulation that destroyed knights' lives, even when it didn't kill them outright. Here's a medieval reality check that reveals everything wrong with knight culture. Your warhorse was literally more valuable than any human relationship in your life, and that wasn't considered strange. It was considered proper prioritization. A Dostoria warhorse cost more than most people's houses and represented your ability to fulfill your military obligations. Without your horse, you weren't a knight. You were just an expensive foot soldier with delusions of grandeur. Medieval military tactics revolved around mounted combat, meaning your horse was your weapons platform, your escape route, and your status symbol simultaneously. NBC News. But the relationship between knight and horse was also deeply dysfunctional in ways that revealed the psychological damage of military culture. You developed stronger emotional bonds with your warhorse than with family members because the horse was your partner in the activities that defined your identity. You spent more time with your horse than with your wife, trusted your horse more than your friends, and probably understood your horse's needs better than your children's. This wasn't romantic, it was deeply unhealthy prioritization that showed how military culture had distorted normal human relationships. You were emotionally bonding with an animal because human relationships had become secondary to your effectiveness as a killing machine. Your horse didn't judge your moral choices, question your orders, or require you to balance competing loyalties the way relationships with people did. The horse also became a symbol of everything wrong with medieval economic priorities. Families would bankrupt themselves to purchase war horses for their knightly sons while peasants starved during bad harvests. Society invested enormous resources in breeding, training, and maintaining animals for warfare, while neglecting basic human needs, like education, healthcare, and food security. Your deep emotional connection to your horse represented the complete victory of military culture over human culture. You had been so thoroughly shaped by the demands of warfare that your most meaningful relationship was with a weapon. Welcome to the psychological torture chamber, known as medieval Christian knighthood, where your profession directly contradicts your religion's core teachings and drives you slowly insane trying to reconcile the contradictions. Christ taught that the meek shall inherit the earth, that you should turn the other cheek, and that violence is morally wrong. As a knight, your entire identity revolves around being violently dominant, striking first before enemies can strike you, and using force to solve problems. You're a professional Christian who makes a living doing things your religion explicitly forbids. Medieval times. The Church tried to resolve this contradiction through concepts like just war and the Crusades, but these theological gymnastics only made the psychological problems worse. Now you had to evaluate whether each conflict met religious criteria for acceptable violence, turning every battle into a moral crisis where you questioned whether you were serving God or damning your soul. Medieval knights developed what we now recognise as severe religious anxiety disorders. Historical accounts describe knights having vivid nightmares about burning in hell, experiencing paralysing guilt about their actions in combat, and becoming obsessed with pilgrimages and religious penances that could supposedly balance out their military sins. Some knights became so consumed by religious guilt that they abandoned knighthood entirely to become monks, recognizing that their profession was incompatible with their spiritual beliefs. But leaving wasn't really an option for most knights because military service was their economic foundation and social identity. You were trapped in a profession that your religion condemned while being financially and socially unable to abandon that profession. The psychological pressure was enormous. Continue serving as a knight and risk eternal damnation, or abandon knighthood and face social disgrace, economic ruin, and family shame. The Church's solution was to encourage knights to channel their violence toward appropriate targets like Muslims, heretics, and other enemies of Christianity. But this just transferred the moral problems rather than solving them, creating a system where your spiritual salvation depended on efficiently killing people who worshipped God differently than you did. Here's where medieval politics gets really psychologically devastating. The feudal system regularly forced knights to fight against people they'd trained with, served alongside, and considered brothers, creating a military culture where loyalty was conditional and friendship was a luxury you couldn't afford. Medieval political alliances shifted constantly based on marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, and economic opportunities. Today's ally could be tomorrow's mortal enemy, and the knights who served under these changing alliances had to be prepared to kill people they'd previously fought to protect. You might spend years serving alongside another knight, developing deep bonds of mutual respect and friendship, only to face him across a battlefield when your lord's political relationships changed. Medieval, life and times. The psychological impact was devastating. Knights developed severe trust issues because any relationship could be terminated by political necessity. You learn not to form deep emotional attachments because those attachments might force you to choose between personal loyalty and feudal obligation, and choosing personal loyalty over feudal duty was considered treason punishable by death. Medieval military culture created a kind of emotional dissociation where knights learned to compartmentalize their relationships based on current political necessity. You could genuinely care about someone while simultaneously preparing to kill them if circumstances changed. This wasn't strength. It was a psychological defense mechanism that protected knights from the constant emotional trauma of having their personal relationships destroyed by political forces beyond their control. The system also created paranoia and social isolation, since any friendship could become dangerous if political alliances shifted many knights became reluctant to form meaningful relationships at all. Better to remain emotionally distant than to risk the psychological devastation of being forced to betray someone you cared about. This isolation was exactly what the feudal system wanted. Knights who were so emotionally dependent on their lord's approval that they had no competing loyalties to interfere with their military effectiveness. Now here's the final crushing reality that reveals everything wrong with medieval knight culture. The entire system was designed to convince you that your life had no value except as a tool for other people's ambitions, and that dying to serve those ambitions was not just acceptable, but the highest possible achievement. Medieval honor culture taught knights that their personal survival was less important than maintaining abstract concepts like reputation, loyalty, and social standing. You were expected to risk death to avoid social embarrassment, choose probable death over certain dishonor, and sacrifice your life to maintain political relationships that benefited everyone except you. Medieval chronicles. The honor system created a psychological trap where self-preservation became shameful and suicidal behavior became admirable. Knights who avoided unnecessary risks were considered cowardly, while knights who died in pointless displays of bravery were celebrated as heroes. Society systematically rewarded the worst possible decision-making and punished knights for making rational choices about their own survival. But here's what makes it truly insidious. The honor system convinced knights that they were privileged participants in a glorious tradition rather than expendable tools in someone else's political machine. You were taught to feel grateful for the opportunity to die young in foreign lands, proud of your willingness to sacrifice everything for people who saw you as replaceable, and honored to participate in a system that consumed your life for other people's benefit. Medieval chronicles are full of stories about knights who died gloriously in battles that accomplished nothing, defending castles that were strategically worthless, and participating in campaigns that only enriched their social superiors. These deaths were celebrated as examples of perfect knighthood, creating a cultural narrative that encouraged more young men to make the same fatal choices. The most successful knights weren't those who lived long, prosperous lives or contributed to human knowledge and culture. They were the ones who died young in the most spectacular possible way, while serving the interest of people who immediately replaced them with younger, equally expendable knights. So the next time you see medieval knights portrayed as romantic heroes, remember that you're looking at a system designed to convince young men that their highest purpose was dying for other people's ambitions. The capacity for glorifying systematic exploitation exists in every human society. We've just gotten better at disguising it with prettier rhetoric and more sophisticated psychological manipulation. The question isn't whether you would have made a good medieval knight. The question is, what modern equivalent of this system are you already participating in without realizing that you're being systematically exploited? What contemporary honor culture is convincing you to sacrifice your well-being for other people's benefit while making you feel privileged to do it? Human nature hasn't changed. Only the armor has gotten lighter and the swords have gotten sharper.